Good morning to everyone. This is the Spanish Civil War, and today we continue our trip back into Spain's history. We left the country at the end of the 19th century, and today we'll cover the first 31 years of this new century. The colored photos used in this episode are courtesy of Eugene, so I'd like to thank him for sharing them with us. The entrance of Spain to the 20th century is marked by the loss of its last colonies, in a time when what defined a powerful nation was a colonial empire. Also, the introduction of the universal masculine suffrage in the last decade of the 19th century meant the control of the election results by the traditional elite was becoming more and more difficult in the cities. Even though vote was almost useless due to the corrupt system, so the only tool workers seemed to have in order to gain better conditions were strikes and terrorism. And the only way Spanish government knew to face the ever-growing dissent seemed to be repression. For example, in 1901, a tram strike was brutally repressed and the state of war declared. Again, in 1902, a new strike was convoked for the 10 hours workday, and the government proclaimed the state of war and sent the army in. Not having yet a modern effective police, this repression was always carried out by the army, and you know what is coming next. The divorce between this institution and the people grow bigger. To worsen the situation, in 1902, an adult, 16 years old, Alfonso the XIII, King of Spain, will start gambling with politics and politicians. He believed himself to be the first soldier of the Spain and backed constantly the army as he shuffled governments as he pleased. In 1905, a joke appeared in the Catalan newspaper Coup. You can see it right now. The man asks the doorkeeper, "What's the party about?" The doorkeeper answers, "It's a victory feast." The man replies, "They must be civilians then." This joke was a punch in the face of the Spanish army that was still recovering itself for the 1998 disaster. 300 army officers attacked the Coup and another Catalan newspaper, La Veu de Catalunya. The officers were not punished, but instead the king backed them, thus opened the path for the law of jurisdictions. By this law, any offense to the army won't be judged by a civil court, but by a military court. Again, the divorce between civil society and the army, what is coming, was growing ever bigger. In 1906 and 1907, in two treaties aimed to prevent German expansion in North Africa, Britain and France decided to cede an influence zone over the Sultanate of Morocco to Spain. At that point, Spain takes this colonial burden. His army is underprepared, and it perceives that it's getting the scraps because it's weakness. In fact, we just need to compare the French and the Spanish zone of influence to see that. The Spanish army, in fact, had lots of problems, among them macrocephaly. Most of the defense budget went to the salaries instead of going to weaponry. To compare it with the British army, in 1909, the Spanish army had 60 generals for 111,435 soldiers. Meanwhile, the British had 34 generals for 374,000 soldiers. Even underprepared, in 1908, the Spanish army launched its first military operation in Morocco in order to secure a port. Lately, an expansion of the recently found reef iron mines was required, but those mines were attacked by the local population. In 1909, at the end of July, two very relevant events happened. While in Morocco, Spanish column was wiped out in the Barranco del Lobo by the local reef tribesmen. In Barcelona, an uprising opposed to the mobilization and death of citizens to protect the owners' interests in Africa led to the Setmana Tragica, tragic week. The city escaped government control for 1 week. The church, still associated with power and absolutism, was one of the main targets of the revolt. When crushed, the repression led to 175 people exiled, 59 sentenced to life imprisonment, and 5 people sentenced to death. Among those sentenced to death, we could find Francesc Ferrer-Guàrdia, founder of the modern school, and Ramon Clemente Garcia, a handicapped guy whose crime was having a dance with the corpse of a nun. The international pressure for the death of Ferrer-Guàrdia made the king cancel his support to Maura's government, making it fall. The Barranco del Lobo ambush marked what would be the fate of the Spanish during the next years in Morocco. The initial strategy used to be the carrot and stick policy, trying to bribe some local leaders and fighting others. But the Spanish army in Morocco was finding itself under budget. Another particularity was that, like in the occupied territories of the Kwantung army, years later, Morocco was not under civil authority, but was the army the one in control of everything. In 1912, the Fed Treaty confirmed the dissolution of the Sultanate. During these years, we see the creation of the first colonial air wing under King Delan, and the sanction of an officer, Capo de Llano, that protested the promotion system used in Africa. These names will become familiar to you. In the mainland, we saw how in 1907 Solidaridad Obrera is created. It will become the CNT in 1910 and will soon temporarily be legalized. But in response, the president of the government, Canalejas, will be killed in 1912. It was not the first head of state killed by anarchists, nor in Europe, nor in Spain. Once I found a curious shirt, Anarchist Magnicide World Tour, with a list of the anarchist magnicides, but couldn't find it anymore. If you find it, post it in the comments, please, so we will have a look at it. Parallel to the creation of Solidaridad Obrera, saw the creation, on the other side of the political spectrum, we could see, of the ACNP, National Catholic Association of Propagandists. It aimed to prevent the poor farmers to become socialists or anarchists. They provide them with credits, machines, etc. In 1917, it merged with the CNCA, National Catholic Agrarian Confederation. They had predication in the mid-fundium areas in the center and northwest of Spain, the ones where, in 1936, the coup succeeded without much difficulty. They were tied to a Catholic newspaper, El Debate. My grandfather, very Catholic man, used to say El Debate was incendiary. The Great War could have been a blessing for Spain. The country was forced into no intervention, so it could sell to everyone, and did so. The industry flourished again, but the benefits were not shared, and the industrialists didn't use the opportunity to improve their infrastructures or the technology. So when the war finished, and the other economies started to recover, Spain sank down again. In 1916, socialist newspapers echoed that most of Spain politicians had a seat in the administrative councils of the biggest companies of the country. If we check where José María Aznar and Felipe González ended, it seemed this rotating door is a Spanish tradition. In 1917, Spain suffers the big crisis of the Restoration. We'll make this long story short. The Catalans on one side. The 48 Catalan deputies asked for a constituent assembly in order to reorganize the state. On the other side, there was a general revolutionary strike being prepared. And on the third side, the army, that had created the Juntas de Defensa in order to change the situation with the promotions in Africa. Here appears maybe, for the first time, but the public eye, the gap between the Continental Army and the African Army. The state just had to listen to the demands of the most powerful group, and we know that was the army. The government found an agreement with the Juntas de Defensa, and the Continental Army crushed both Catalans and the strike. The repression against realities like the UGT, PSOE's trade union, will remain in the collective memory of their future leaders, and from now on they will be very careful with their participation in this sort of strikes. Between 1919 and 1920, strikes in Andalusia were brutally repressed by the civil guard and the landowners. In a sort of colonial fashion, even the army was also sent in. In Barcelona, in 1919, happened something we can still hear the echoes today. A strike on the Barcelona traction light and power company, known as La Cadalenca, paralyzed the city. Soon they were joined by other sectors of the working force. The army had to be sent in, but to take the strikers' role in the electrical company. Barcelona was left in the dark during the cold 1919 winter. The economy was harmed and people were dying. The strike was born aiming for the readmission of some fired workers and the revocation of some new salary measures, but ended up bringing to Spain the 8-hour workday. This major victory didn't improve the situation in Barcelona. Milán del Bosch was since 1918 the Captain General of Catalonia. The growing revolutionary movements tied to the growth of the population after the after-war crisis were treated without mercy. They used the ley de fugas, rabbit race. They usually meant they freed the prisoners, told them to leave, and shoot them in the back because they were escaping. To even put more pressure on those trade unions, in 1919 the Syndicat Lliures were created. They were free trade unions. They were not really trade unions, but groups of good men that worked for the industrialists and that used to kill members of the trade unions and disrupt strikes. Federico Carlos Bas, civil governor of Barcelona after Milan, stated that most of the deaths in the city were workers, so it was mostly the patronal employers association the one continuing with terrorism. In fact, their objectives were the moderate members of the trade unions, as Francesc Layret or Salvador Seguí, the ones that opposed direct action and searched for a compromise. When substituted by the butcher Martínez Añido, photo, Bas will say, "I've been kicked out because I refuse to be an assassin." The turmoil grew up in Spain soon after the Great War. For Graham, demographic changes and the economical crisis brought by the end of the war had a very important role in shaping Spanish fate. But it was a glass that was getting full. In 1919, when the CNT had 700,000 members, there were 71,444 strikes. In 1920, the strikes were 244,784. In 1921, the echoes of the Communist Revolution divided the PSOE, and the PCE, Spanish Communist Party, was born. That same year, Eduardo Dato, Spain's Prime Minister, was shot dead by 3 anarchists. In 1920, something happened that will also have echoes in the future: the creation of the Spanish Foreign Legion, La Legión. Spain found itself with a problem in his protectorate. England and France could use troops from every corner of the colonial empires, but Spain, having just one colony, could only recruit troops from the Rif, the Regulares, a corps established in 1905. So they were forced to use the people from the region to subjugate their connationals. And that's no good. The creation of the Legion was an opportunity, even the bulk of it remained Spanish, to recruit veterans from the Great War. People that could not reintegrate themselves into the civilian life, people with emotional scars joined the corps, inspired by the Bushido, an even more closed, total institution than the army itself. In 1921, the unreliability of the colonial troops was proven, as some of them turned against the Spanish during the annual disaster. France, Italy, and Great Britain had already been through this. A great defeat coming from an uncivilized nation. Abdelkrim, leader of the rebels, was, until that moment, a friend of Spain. He thought Spain would help with the development of the area, but it didn't. So in 1921, he raised against the Spanish the mine, and for the Rif independence. The tribesmen utterly destroyed the Spanish army, in what is known in Spain as the disaster of Annual. Between 8,000 and 12,000 Spanish soldiers would die. The catastrophe had 2 major consequences. The first, the recrudescence of the colonial war. From this moment, the Spanish colonial army, only authority in the protectorate, there was no civilian authority, as we've already said, will take a more violent strategy in order to finish with the rebels, including beheading of the prisoners and the use of chemical weapons. This violence was part of the life of Franco's, Quindelán, Yahweh, Riquelme, the small one in this photo, and Mola, allegedly the only one in the Spanish army that had a map, according to Dubisson from the French army. The second consequence of the annual defeat was that the general, Picasso, was tasked to create a report about the disaster in order to find the responsibles. As the piles of files were growing and reached the top commanders, the doors began to close. So, at the end, this report was only used to unfairly blame low-ranking officers. But apart from that, when the report was to arrive in Parliament, General Primo de Rivera, with the support of Catalan industrialists, decided to take the driver's place and made a coup. Primo de Rivera's dictatorship was approved by the king, Alfonso the XIII. He would refer to him as his personal Mussolini. It was the last chance the monarch had to maintain that inefficient exploitation system by the oligarchy towards an undeveloped country. Primo wanted to retreat from the Morocco adventure. He will have some arguments with the African army. Allegedly, he'd say to them, "You have no right to believe you've got the monopoly of patriotism." And that was a bit what the African army believed. In fact, as the death toll continued to grow, the Chauen retreat costed 18,000 casualties to the Spanish army. Capo de Llano and Franco tried to make another coup, but it didn't progress. When, with the partial retreat proposed by Primo de Rivera, he was not that wrong. The French started getting worried about Abdelkrim incursions in their part of the protectorate. They agreed with Spain for a joint operation. This operation takes place in 1925, the Desembarco de Alhucemas, and will bring the end to the war by 1927. The French army admired the improvement of the Spanish army capability, but they were a bit worried about their brutality. In 1926, Primo creates a National Assembly that should work as a sort of parliament. Meanwhile, a frustrated coup seems to show that there's a conservative opposition that wishes to return to the 1876 constitution, and it starts to get more and more adepts among the traditional oligarchy. That same year, a Republican alliance is also created, and the dictator breaks with the artillery branch of the army because he is in intermission with the promotions. One of its main opponents inside the corps will be Juan Hernández Sarabia, future Republican war minister during a brief period at the beginning of the Civil War. That black year, the dictator had at least one victory as he frustrated an invasion of Catalonia led by the Catalan nationalist Colonial, known in Catalonia as the Grandfather. With the victory in Africa, Primo felt himself powerful and popular enough to dive even more into his dictatorial powers, eliminating the already almost non-existent separation between powers in the state. As the king had given his support to Primo, his fate is linked now with the one of the dictator. In fact, as we've said before, Alfonso the XIII said it was his personal Mussolini. With the fall of Mussolini, he'll fall too. In 1928, as Capo de Llano, again this name, is sent to reserve because it's indiscipline, the universities of all over Spain are in open rebellion and more of 4,000 Republicans are detained. In 1929, a coup fails, but it seems the dictatorship is not going that good. To worsen the situation, 1929's crack will provoke the paralyzation of all investments and the peseta will fall 10 pounds in 2 years. At that point, the UGT, that was in a sort of collaboration with the dictatorship, decided to ally with the Republicans. In fact, during the dictatorship they have lost half of their members. 1930 begins with a new coup being forged by General Godet. But 27th of January, Primo de Rivera, after asking the other generals for their support and receiving no answer, resigns. His substitute will be General Berenguer, starting the Dicta Blanda. Here I have to explain something. The word dictadura in Spanish means dictatorship, has the word hard, dura, inside. The rule of Berenguer will be known as the Dicta Blanda. As blanda means soft, it will be a kind of soft dictatorship. Berenguer was maybe the highest ranking officer that avoided any responsibility for the annual disaster. He found very early that he could not form any government. The people that had participated in the dictatorship, like Calvo Sotelo, remember his name, that was the finance minister, were marked, and others refused to participate. In 1930, as the country was ravaged by strikes, Alcalá Zamora, former cacique and minister during the dictatorship, Ángel Osorio, Sánchez Guerra, and the son of Maura, all of them influential political figures, will give their back to the kings, as the UGT and the PSOE declared that the Berenguer government was not legitimate. In August, a big pact is seen between all the Republican realities of the state in San Sebastian. The path to the Republic lies open. But the Dicta Blanda was not that soft. As the 13th of November, in the funeral of some worker, there's a Polish charge that ends with 2 deaths and 49 wounded. 1 month later, the Republic is proclaimed, but it's too early. The coup fails. Ramon Franco, the brother of the general, will be one of the participants, as also Captains Galan and Garcia Hernández. With the failure of the coup, Galan and Garcia Hernández will be shot, but they will become the first martyrs of the upcoming Republic. At the beginning of 1931, a new government is created that has the main aim to prepare municipal elections. This government will be nicknamed by Maura the grave daggers of the monarchy, the death metal band from Spain. The elections are programmed for the 12th of April, and the Republican wins in almost every provincial capital. In Barcelona, Macià declares the Catalan Republic inside the Iberian Federation, but after some calls and negotiations with Madrid, he backs down. The Republic is being proclaimed in every city. The 14th, the Republic is officially proclaimed, and the king leaves Spain, even if he forgets to abdicate. If Buckley's notes are not wrong, Alfonso the XIII had 30 cabinets and 16 prime ministers between 1902 and 1923. It seemed that Caciquism was wounded, even not death, that there could be from now on fair elections in Spain, and that the era of the oligarchy and landowners would be something of the past. The Republic meant the arrival of something new and desired. But will this Republic fulfill the claims of a combative working class, of the masses of temporary workers in the south? What will the oligarchy do from now on? The dictatorship had ended, but it will become a myth of progress for the Spanish right, the happy 20s, even if it left Spain with huge debts. And the Republic will take the reins 2 years after the 1929 crack. So it will find itself without money to implement their policies, nor the possibility to get credits from the exterior. To see what will happen, follow us. As always, we left lots of stuff behind. We know it, but the time was short. And at least with these episodes, we brought a bit of light to the situation in Spain during the first part of the 20th century. In the next episode, we'll cover the Spanish situation during the Republic. If you missed our last episode, here's a link. Also, you have here the link to a video collaboration between the Great War and Sierra Arsenal about Spain during the Great War. We've been using photos because it's expensive and difficult to find videos. British Pate has an amazing collection. In fact, in the description, you'll find a link to a couple of their videos regarding the abdication of Alfonso the XIII and the Rif War. But they asked too much money in order to get the rights to use them. Maybe with your help we'll be able to get some videos. Keep in mind that the Spanish Civil War was like the World Wars, but with less budget. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe us. If you enjoyed it, share it. We have to bring light to the history of Spain. If you can take it to school also, do it. If you are able to support us in our Patreon channel, this could be great. Thanks for your attention.